including those who are joining us online. Thank you very much for making the time for this farewell lecture by James. James is leaving us at the end of the month after a very consequential nearly 12 years with ECA. He has done enormous work here that nearly everyone in this room and attending will be familiar with. I will not spend much time on that piece of work because I'm sure most people will speak to it. But to fully appreciate James' lecture today, you need to appreciate his work with 3 storied institutions before he got here. And it's a measure of James' professional accomplishments and consistency that his work before he got here arguably eclipses the enormous work that he has done here. Certainly, you really do need to understand the work he did with these 3 historic institutions to appreciate the lecture today. So I first met James through his work nearly 10 years before I would meet him in person. As program manager for Ford Foundation, he was the environment manager, program manager for Ford Foundation, Southern Africa. He led really enormous body of work on land reform, land rights, and land tenure across Africa. That work led to what is now known as PLAS at the university. Many colleagues within the ECA, AUC, or FDB who work on land and land policy center will be very familiar with that work. Because it's focused on climate change here, most people will forget that James is one of the foremost land tenure experts on the continent. I was doing my PhD work when I came across much of the work that he personally did, but also that he has sponsored through that work. Then he ended up working for 2 other storied organizations at the height of their power and influence. And that power and influence of those organizations was in part because of James's work. James was regional director for IUCN Southern Africa office. Now, that is a storied office. It has produced a number of distinguished environmentalists and, for lack of a better word, climatologists. Among them, Akim Steiner, Salim Fakir, Katerere. Some people may be attending this conference. I don't want to embarrass them. That office did enormous work on land and conservation and conservation more broadly and environmental policy more broadly at the height of major controversies on those issues globally and within the African continent, which is part of the reason it raised the generation of international experts that it raised. I joined that office 10 years after James had left, but people were still speaking in awe of his work. It's a very interesting office. Either it will eat you alive and you won't come out of that office, or if you come out of that office, you will end up with very powerful international enemies. And sometimes it's good to have powerful international enemies. They help keep you. And I think James is a beneficiary of that experience. From ROSA, it's known as, that is IUCN Regional Office for Southern Africa. From ROSA, James went to Codestria, where he also led a major piece of work on responsive forest governance initiative that laid the groundwork for much of the work on UN RED and pioneered much of the scholarship on community-based forest management. I identify these 3 examples because if you know anything about Codestria, at least at the height of its past, which is when James was there, they had a very rigorous political economy analysis tradition, a very rigorous social science tradition overall, but a very rigorous political economy analysis tradition. And the distinctive thing with ROSA, that is the IUCN Regional Office for Southern Africa, was what you might call a very rigorous political ecology tradition. And James' work brings those two traditions. First of all, it's highly analytical, but it brings those two perspectives together. So you get real insights from political economy analysis, but merged with political ecology analysis. And you'll appreciate that in the presentation is going to make today. In addition to the research and policy work and advocacy that is done on climate, on environment, on land, James has also been a mentor, training a significant generation of professionals in all of these areas and in all of this. This obviously goes back to his training and first job as a university lecturer at another esteemed African institution, the University of Zimbabwe. So if you had a career as expansive as James and as influential as James, and you are leaving an institution like the ECA at this point in time, how do you frame your farewell lecture? So we struggle with this quite a bit because we wanted to benefit from James' experience from all these organizations and all of this, but also his reflections on what might be the opportunities for us going forward. We encouraged him, not that he needed any encouragement, as you all know, but we encouraged him to be thoughtful and to challenge us. He always does that. We encourage him to do even more of that now. My hope is that James is not leaving the profession. He may be leaving ECA, but he's not leaving the field, and will continue to engage with him. With that introduction, let me welcome James. So we have 90 minutes. It was supposed to be, I think now we have 80 minutes. James will speak for about 30 minutes. I'll try to keep him to that time frame. And then we'll have distinguished colleagues and partners of ours reflecting on that lecture for 5 minutes each. So our personal friend, Dr. Samson Ogallah from the AUC, who's joining us here in person. Thank you, Samson. A former colleague and a distinguished professional, like Dr. Linus Mofor, who's now with UNICEF in Nairobi. All these are friends and partners, so I'm struggling with Martha Bekele, founder of Development Transformation, and from PACJA, Charles Mwangi. We are also expecting the Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist of the ECA to join the conversation at some point. It is a conversation, so once we've had reflections, we'll limit each of the discussants to 5 minutes so that we have an opportunity both inside this room and electronically to engage James. With that, James, it's been a pleasure. As I said a moment ago, I'm in denial. I don't think you're leaving anyway. You're not leaving the profession. But please use this opportunity to share your insights with us and to challenge us. James' lecture today is very appropriate for us in the context of the global climate agenda, but also in the context of COP32. It's on the narrative in climate finance, from duty to opportunity and back to duty. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Cosmas. Good morning, greetings, colleagues in the room and joining us virtually. First, Cosmas, you know, listening to that very flattering, long introduction, there were times when I felt like I was listening to my own obituary. I appreciate that, of course, you recognize some of all of those things, journeys, institutions that we have engaged in, and also the work that we've jointly done together in the past. But I would like to assure colleagues joining us here that, as Cosmas says, I hope that this is not farewell, as the lecture says, but this is so long that there will be other opportunities for us to meet, to interact, and to join together in advancing Africa's cause, particularly in the course of in the context of COP32, which is going to be in Addis Ababa in 2027, which will be the 6th time that Africa convenes this global conference of parties. Now, as you know, in addressing climate change, we are addressing at the same time issues regarding financing the climate response, issues regarding the climate response itself in terms of what is happening in energy, what is happening in mitigation, but also issues of politics, the politics of that whole process of financing the response and calibrating the climate response as it were. And it is this third aspect of the climate response that tends to be under-analyzed, to use a term, but which perhaps is the most influential in shaping, in determining the nature of the climate response. And this is particularly important today, if you can go to my first slide, in the context of the evolving context in which we are operating today. So we know that in the COPs and also outside of the COPs, the biggest issue, the biggest debates that are happening are around financing the governance of the climate system. But we also know that the biggest differences between the major blocks globally are around that question of financing climate change. These differences are happening in a global order that is characterized by immense crisis in the multilateral system. The crisis represents itself in various ways, but we know that there are serious power asymmetries between the developed industrialized nations, the global north, and the global south. If you recall, if you think back to the construction of the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the main unresolved questions of the SDGs was, in fact, how do you actually advance a global development trajectory with a mechanism which is incapable of resolving those power differentials between the developed and the development. In other words, the big unresolved question was, can you actually reduce development to a technical managerial process without engaging the politics of development? To this day, that question is unresolved. And perhaps this accounts for many of the challenges that we face in attaining the SDGs. So these crises in the multilateral system are reflected also in the outcomes that we get from the WTO, but also that we get from other UN processes, the COPs and so on. So I'll speak to that a little bit, but in terms of the climate crisis, when you know the mechanism that is used to understand the effectiveness of the Paris Agreement is the global stocktake, where you aggregate the impact of all of the nations' individual climate actions together to look at whether in fact they are contributing to the 1.5 degrees goal of the Paris Agreement, right? That is the global stocktake. And we know for sure, only last week we heard from some of the leading meteorologists that in fact we are not on course to achieving the 1.5 degrees. So we can forget about 1.5 degrees going to COP32. We need to begin to think about whether we can in fact remain within the 2 degrees guardrail. Remember, Paris had 2 guardrails. The principal one is 1.5 degrees, but if we can't achieve that, which probably means the parties to the Paris Agreement already understood that it may be challenging to achieve 1.5. So the alternative was 2 degrees. But the global stocktake in fact says that we are on course for 2.7 degrees warming, close to 3 degrees. So our effort has to be, how do we get to? So the first crisis is emissions are rising, where we have in place a mechanism to manage those emissions. The credibility of the process is also eroding. But the central struggle that we're experiencing now is about how to finance climate action. For us in the Global South, financing climate action means how do we mobilize resources for adaptation, because that is our main challenge. But also how do we compensate for the loss damages that we are experiencing? And principally, how do we invest in the energies that would enable us to either leapfrog, in other words, to avoid emissions, or how do we embark on a course of development that enables us to emit and then decline our emissions in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So these are the main issues. As I said, we have to address all of these at the same time. But for practical purposes, I'm going to focus only on the climate finance issue. And if we have time, we can expand that discussion to energy and so on. Next slide, please. So the core thesis that I'm going to be advancing today is that, in fact, there are several processes and developments that are underway, which not only frame the way in which we understand the climate challenge, but which also condition the response to that climate crisis. So in terms of climate finance, the core focus of this discussion is that climate finance, in fact, has actually undergone a very deliberate narrative shift from the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement and beyond the Paris Agreement. If you recall, the Kyoto Protocol did two things. It recognized the differential contributions of developed and developing nations to the current status of the climate system. In other words, it recognized that the emissions, the aggregated impact of emissions from the Industrial Revolution to 1992 was largely reflective of the GDP increase in the developed nations. Or to put it differently, you cannot separate development, fossil-fueled development, from climate change. So all of that development that you experienced, you can actually link each unit of GDP to the amount of emissions which resulted in that development. And that, therefore, the solution to the climate crisis was in dividing responsibility between those who were the emitters and those who were the victims of those emissions. So the Kyoto Protocol created, or rather, divided countries into those countries whose responsibility was to mitigate, that is to reduce their emissions, but also to pay for the impacts of their emissions. And those countries whose responsibility was to design adaptation activities, initiatives, and programs with support from the emitting countries. Annex A and Annex B. We all know that history. So Kyoto provided legal responsibilities clearly framed for emissions, for payment, and for reductions. The Paris Agreement also did two things. Firstly, the Paris Agreement said, and of course we know that the Paris Agreement 2015, after 7 years of Kyoto, recognized the failure of Kyoto to manage, if you want, to discipline the behavior of emitting countries. So even during Kyoto, emissions were increasing. But the cost of emissions was also increasing because of the enforcement of Kyoto mechanisms. So what Paris did, and what the powerful countries did, was basically to say that Kyoto was not tenable because they could not continue to pay for the climate crisis, while particularly emerging economies were increasing their emissions, right? So this is the time when China, India, Indonesia, Russia were developing rapidly, and were also therefore increasing their emissions rapidly. And they were catching up with the Annex A countries. And so in order to respond to that challenge, the Paris Agreement was designed in such a way that everyone had to contribute to emissions reductions, to adaptation, and to the cost. So the Paris Agreement significantly moves away from legal mechanisms and of assigning duties and responsibilities to market opportunities for investing in the transition. We'll discuss this in greater detail. But what this effectively does is it reassigns the benefit, the burden of addressing climate change from public budgets of northern developed countries to everyone. So everyone actually now begins to bear a financial burden in terms of responding to the climate change. But also it ensures that I'm from Southern Africa. Southern countries also begin to contribute other aspects of their own budgets, but also their leadership, so-called, and their ecosystems to the climate response. And this is a very significant point, because if you look at the outcomes of the last Africa Climate Summits, you hear the emergence of this narrative of Africa as a leader in providing climate solutions. Africa is a powerhouse of solutions. And the solutions that are being referred to here, well, Africa has the critical minerals, which are going to undergird the battery or the energy initiatives that are required for mitigation. Africa has the sun, which is going to support renewable energy. Africa has the wind, and Africa has the ecosystems. And each of these solutions is deeply problematic, extremely problematic. But there is, in fact, very little engagement with the issues that arise out of this so-called Africa leadership. And so I want us to be able to address some of these issues, and I will seek to see if I can make a presentation. Now, let me just also express some caveats regarding this thesis that I am proposing. Firstly, it is a structural critique of the way in which global power is exercised in all its various forms. It is not a conspiracy theory that I'm going to be advocating. Rather, what I seek to be doing is basically to show that the prevailing architecture of climate finance predictably produces outcomes which are not aligned with equity, with developmental needs, with climate vulnerability, or with the political objectives of southern countries. And this misalignment occurs even when we are operating under the language of solidarity and urgency. In other words, even all the global multilateral frameworks that we are using, we are applying, it is in fact those frameworks that are producing this language which disguises the underlying inequities. So that's my first caveat. The second caveat is that the institutions that are participating in the construction of this narrative implementation, in other words, in defining what the response should be and how it should be carried out, are more driven by institutional perspective rather than by individual contributions, so to speak. So, for instance, the fact that you have what I call broadly in my paper neoliberal hegemonies reflects an underlying ideological perspective which underlies the thinking of those institutions. So institutions are already preconditioned to think in ways. The third caveat is, although I'm framing it as the imposition of a global northern perspective, ideological, political, economic, the South itself is not a recipient of these narratives, but is actually forced to receive those conditions that they find themselves in. In other words, the developing nations still have agency, but they can only exercise that agency under constraint. And I'll give examples of how this actually happens. Significantly, I think that the challenge to the narrative, the global narrative of climate change as an opportunity of investment of the market is emerging in the legal context rather than in the negotiation context. And this is particularly evident in the the advisory opinion that was given by the International Court of Justice in 2024 regarding the legal responsibilities of the states, individual states. Step back a little. The reason why we have the global institutional context of addressing the climate system is precisely because the atmosphere is indivisible. You cannot divide the atmosphere. Portion of the atmosphere above Zimbabwe is the responsibility of Zimbabwe. That portion is Kenya, that portion is Nigeria. Because it is indivisible, which is a global commons. And in order to address a global commons, you need a global mechanism, institutional mechanism that is capable of regulating the behavior of all of the participants in that commons. This is the quintessential commons problem, right? However, the addressing of this global commons initiative through the institution, the United Nations institutions, global institutions, has in fact not sought to apply legal mechanisms to regulate the use of the atmosphere. The Paris Agreement is very specific. It actually seeks nations to act in the best interest of their own, what they call enlightened self-interest. And again, if you understand the theory of enlightened self-interest, what it says is, if I realize that my actions are going to have an impact, a negative impact on everyone else, I am constrained to actually act positively. But we know the reality, if you look at what is happening globally now, especially what is happening with the biggest hegemon on the global stage, that enlightened self-interest, or rather that self-interest is not necessarily enlightened. Yeah. If you have the power, you can do what you want. And no one can stop you. So that's my fourth caveat, that the economics, the finances are beginning or to be resolved in a legal sense through, and we don't know the effectiveness of those legal, but at least there is a process that is underway. And so my thesis is really about the political economy of the climate system. It is not about climate change projects or those kinds of things. Next, please. So, specifics of how the narrative shift has occurred. Remember, we said at the beginning, the Kyoto process was about assigning responsibilities and obligations and hoping that these responsibilities would force emitters to reduce their emissions, while those who are suffering the impacts would get support for designing their adaptation and other initiatives. So in the Kyoto and indeed in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, climate finance is an obligation and a responsibility of the developed countries, firstly. And secondly, that this climate finance should be delivered in grants and public transfers based on the historical responsibilities of the emitters. That's the Kyoto Finance Framework, very summarized. In the Paris Agreement and the post-Paris framework, climate finance is no longer about mobilization. And you hear that language frequently, right? How do we mobilize 1.3 trillion? How did we fail to mobilize $100 billion? And so on. It is not about providing, meeting our legal obligations. It's about mobilization. Again, this has got significant implications. But this mobilization is also not in public funds. It is mobilization framed in loans, in equity, in blended finance, and all of those so-called innovative mechanisms. And again, we need to interrogate very thoroughly what is innovative about the mechanisms that are being advanced. We'll get to that. Effectively, what has shifted is a shift from historical responsibility to enabling a market-based response to the climate. In other words, the climate response, the climate challenge can be addressed if the price is right. Right? If we can pay for adaptation, if we can pay for mitigation, if we can pay for changing the ways in which we generate energy, we will do it. But if the price is not right, we will not do it. And this perhaps also explains why we actually continue to have increasing investments in fossil fuels, increasing emissions, while in fact nothing significant is happening in renewable alternative energies. Next slide, please. So that is how the framing has happened in the Kyoto to Paris context. In terms of the specifics of this framing, firstly, I think there is an argument that has been made. I cannot recall exactly which COP actually began this conversation about there simply is not enough public finance to respond to address the climate finance requirements of developing nations. But this discourse, which actually culminated in the COP 27, the Glasgow COP, was it 26 or 27? But you recall one of the outcomes of the Glasgow COP was the so-called Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. The basis of GFANZ was that because there isn't sufficient public finance, we do recognize that there is more than enough private finance to supply the 1.3 trillion that you are all. The only problem that you have is you are incapable of designing projects and proposals that can leverage that $1.3 trillion. You recall that, right? So everyone then started working in the process towards COP28, the Cairo COP. Everyone started working on how do we identify investment-ready initiatives. In other words, initiatives that are designed in ways that meet the metrics of the properly designed projects. Now, the metrics or the ways in which the market understands how a project should function. So we all ran around, went to African Union, looked at PACJA, tried to understand which of the existing PACJA projects can be financed. Everyone did. But did anyone see the 1.3 trillion at COP28? No, it did not emerge. In fact, today, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero has collapsed completely. All of the financial institutions that were part of that alliance have moved out for different reasons, including, of course, the argument that, in fact, we are still incapable of developing investment-ready projects. So there was no project to be financed, regardless of the reality being the opposite. So that was one of the ways in which this narrative shift was packaged. We don't have sufficient public finance, but we have sufficient private finance. In effect, we know that even the private finance has not been available. But that there is a definite cap on how much we can expect in terms of grants, but also that we cannot express our demands for climate finance as demands for climate justice, and that climate justice is unrealistic. I've heard in many corridors people telling me that, well, you are not being realistic. You cannot tell taxpayers of another country to build. You are the ones who are experiencing the climate damage, and therefore you should innovate how you respond to climate. In other words, we have this normalization that the climate response should be an investment opportunity for private finance rather than a global public responsibility. So there are many specific mechanisms which are used to actually solidify this type of thinking. Next slide, please. One of them, and again, we're all familiar, is that it is very risky to invest in developing nations, right? And that therefore what you really need is to de-risk the de-risking narrative, de-risking and public blended finance. The way it works in de-risking is that you use your own public money to ensure that, in fact, the private investment does not suffer any losses from whatever they see as a risk in investment. So what you have is public investment in removing whatever the source of the risk is, and private capital benefit from the profits of that investment. A lot of the de-risking is, of course, through debt, and that debt continues to be public debt. So the outcome here is that climate action becomes an asset class, an investment. It is not a public good. The second mechanism is a privatization and an assetization of nature. This actually has a much longer pedigree than the current focus in climate change. And perhaps this is where Cosmas says we created a lot of global enemies. The origin of this assetization of nature was in fact in a suite of forest management initiatives, which were called Payments for Environmental Services, PACE, which evolved several years ago, and which at IUCN we challenged as being very specifically neoliberal perspectives that sought to turn ecosystems and natural resources into new sites of investment of capital, but also new sites of a struggle between local communities and other local uses. So what ecosystem services basically does is you look at a wetland, and you say, okay, this wetland can actually clean the water supply of a city like Addis Ababa, much cheaper than us investing in chemicals and other mechanical treatment and so on. So let's find someone who can actually invest in managing this wetland sustainably. And in so doing, in other words, let's remove the ownership of this wetland from the city of Addis Ababa. Let's make it a private. And whoever is managing it, we don't pay them. No. Everyone who uses the water from that wetland then becomes their use. In other words, you've made it into a private asset. You have assetized the wetland. The same thing is happening with forests. The whole continent, the argument in nature-based solutions is that, well, Africa has forests and wetlands and other ecosystems which can absorb most of the global emissions. The biological reality is that the sequestration of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is an ongoing biological process. No one produces trees to do this, right? Forests are already performing that function. But in order to turn these forests into ecosystem service, you have to privatize them first. The mechanism you use is what some of our colleagues are working on, which are the carbon markets. The carbon markets, you basically use different cadastral systems, define a forest area, calculate how much carbon is going to be sequestered by that. Go north, look for someone who is emitting and ask them to pay the potential of that. This is exactly what is happening. It's a privatization process. And it's part of this assetization of nature. So what is happening there is carbon sinks are being turned into tradable credits rather than retained as normal biological forests. The consequence of this is, again, it is contributing towards our narrative of Africa as a powerhouse of climate solutions. Again, we'll discuss how problematic this is. Next slide, please. So I've talked about only 3 of the methods used to promote this narrative of the market as a solution. Now, we, the developing countries, are constrained to accept these narratives. We are not necessarily consenting because we agree with the ways in which the narratives are framed, but rather we have serious and urgent problems that we have to address. We have poverty, we have all of these emerging climate disasters and so on, which are immediate and which will not wait for us to resolve the philosophical discussions about what is the correct way of understanding the problem. So climate disasters are immediate and costly. If you're following what is happening in Southern Africa now, I mean, this is massive, right? We have whole regions which are underwater with perhaps very limited capacity to respond to those disasters. The cost of those disasters is going to be massive and additional to occurred last year, the previous year, and so on. And we don't have the capacity to address those. We don't have the capacity because the grants that have been promised, for instance, to build our disaster risk management capacity, they have not materialized. We have to borrow money to invest in hydromet facilities and all of those things. But money that comes is acceptable. If you are in this kind of situation, if you are hungry, you have not eaten, and someone comes with food, you'll eat it regardless of whether that food is injera or sadza or what your preference is. So we are being forced to into these narratives without necessarily exercising our agency. And you can see these changes that are happening in all of the texts of the COPs. Cosmas asked me the other day can we, for instance, invest in some time in understanding how these shifts have been happening from the first COP until now. It's a massive exercise, but it can be done. I think we really need to invest this kind of time in order to, particularly if COP32 is meaningful for Africa to push back on these narratives. Next slide. That means what, 10 minutes? So there are different tensions that we see in the mechanisms that exist. I'm being told to speed up. So firstly, if you look at the debates in the courts now, they are focusing on Article 9.1, or rather Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. Article 9 is that article which provides for the ways in which finance should be provided. The original framing in Article 9.1 is that developed nations shall provide. Those of you who are lawyers will know that shall, in fact, is actually binding. It is not a choice. You have to do it. It is not like may or could or whatever. So Article 9.1 expressly says developed countries shall provide finance to developing countries. But elsewhere in the Article 9, the language is developed countries can mobilize those funds from all sources available. In other words, it can be investment, it can be loans, it can be whatever it is. And the result is that loans and private finance are still being counted as climate finance, even as we have a counter narrative that is developing against loans as climate finance. Next one, please. So there is a tension there in the Paris Agreement, and this tension is going to continue to COP32 for sure, because there is a work program that is continuing, which should be resolved in Addis Ababa, and perhaps we can contribute towards ensuring that the African voice is about ensuring that climate finance does not add to the debt that we already experience, but rather creates conditions for us to become more resilient by increasing the public fiscal space that is available for us. The other narrative is about reforming the global financial architecture. Again, we have all heard about this, and it's a narrative which actually did not emerge directly from the COP negotiations, but from the debt and trade negotiations. But this narrative basically says that the multilateral development finance system is not fit for purpose. The purpose being, how can it actually resolve all of the challenges of indebtedness, poverty, and so on. The effect of the narrative, though, and the process is that multilateral development institutions are in fact beginning to function like investment mechanisms. And I think we can make the same criticism, for instance, of development banks, like the African Development Bank, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and so on. If you look closely at the way in which they are structured, they are in fact market-related rather than development-influenced. And so they prioritize leverage ratios, they look at how they can crowd in private capital and so on. And they move us further away from the grant-based logic of the UNFCCC era. So what has changed? If you look at the next okay, before I go to there is the one of the main one of the key interventions in the energy transition or so-called transition discourse are these just energy transition partnerships, again, which emanated from the Glasgow COP, with the first one being in an $8 billion sort of suite of funds made available to South Africa to transition from coal to renewable. The bulk of that is in fact actually in loans rather than in grants. Although these loans are framed as concessional loans, they are still loans. They still have to be paid back. But the coal phase out, South Africa is the biggest consumer of coal on the African continent, and I think the 12th biggest globally. It's very difficult. Again, if we had time, we would discuss this, but it's very difficult to bracket South Africa's climate response together with the rest of the continent because of the structure, historical and contemporary, of that economy. But the coal phase out in South Africa through that just energy transition partnership was actually framed as an investment opportunity. How can new investors come in, take advantage of that 8 billion, borrow from that 8 billion or whatever in order to invest in clean energy? The irony for me personally is that South Africa was also the beneficiary of the biggest loan ever made by the World Bank, which was the 500 billion loan for the Medupi coal power plant, which to this day is not yet fully functional. And so on the one hand, you are going to be paying for that loan. On the other hand, you're taking on new loans to transition from the use of that. So there's a big contradiction there, which perhaps we need to bring into the public discourse. But the total impact of these JETPs, it's not only South Africa, we also have Senegal, Indonesia, several other countries. But the net impact is that it increases debt and shrinks fiscal space. Moving quickly from there, Aman, just some of the toolkits of the innovative, so-called innovative climate finance narrative. The biggest ones are the debt for nature swaps, the nature-based solutions that we talked about, and the green bonds and environmental criteria, which all promise win-wins, but all actually deepen the asymmetries that we talked about. Very quickly, if we can go through each of them. Firstly, the debt for nature swaps. The narrative is that this is a double win in that you actually get for a debt for nature swaps. I'm assuming we all know how these operate, but you get a double win in firstly investment in biodiversity conservation, and secondly, you also get debt relief. Someone buys your debt or part of your debt and invests that portion in conservation. The reality of data for nature swaps is that, in fact, less than 0.1% of Africa's debt is today been absorbed into these mechanisms. The other outcome is that, in fact, it passes on the control and responsibility for ecosystems to third parties, typically NGOs, northern NGOs. For nature swap that we had on the continent, I think, was Seychelles a few years back. But that was the Nature Conservancy, TNC, offering to take over control, or rather management, take over some of Seychelles' debt in return of a lot of the Seychelles coastal area, the protected marine ecosystems of Seychelles. So one of the impacts of these swaps is it opens up control of natural resources to third parties, which is an erosion of sovereignty, right? But it also functions to make these illegitimate debts appear greening of debt, and another discourse is developing around that. Next one is the nature-based solutions and the green bonds. Again, I think I've talked a little bit about the nature-based solutions, but see, I mean, the main challenge of carbon markets, carbon trading, and so on, is that they are based on offsetting carbon and reducing carbon emissions. The economics for me is perfect. I mean, it's based on the argument that emissions are a negative externality. So if you're not paying for the externality, you can emit as much as possible. In order to force emissions, you then force them to buy carbon credits, right? If the price of carbon credits could only be greater than the cost of emissions, but unfortunately that has never been the case. In Africa, the highest that a carbon credit has ever been sold for is $18. That was last year in Zimbabwe, after Zimbabwe digitized the carbon registry and so on. Prior to that, the highest was $7 a ton of carbon, which is meaningless. I mean, you could cut down a ton of trees, sell it as firewood, and earn more than $7. And then the same thing applies to green bonds as well. The green bonds reward investors, they have regulation, and they normally support or typically support politicized climate action. So in a synthesis, we could say that what is common to all of these different mechanisms is that, firstly, they are based on climate action being profitable. Secondly, they are based on socializing the risk of climate action and privatizing the returns to individual investors. And to do that, nature has to become an investment. So here, the core question shifts from what does the planet need to what can be made bankable. Again, like we said earlier, if the price is not right, we are not going to invest in it. Now, so these are the main narratives, but there are responses to these narratives, and this is my last point, Cosmas. Cosmas is getting fidgety. The counter narrative, what is changing? I think, firstly, you have massive development of debt justice coalitions. This is outside of the climate sort of focus, but it is happening. A lot of civil society actors are actually questioning the justice of the current debt, sovereign debt that we have on the continent. We are also beginning to get coordination between borrower nations, which are also seeking to redefine the ways in which we understand the whole sort of a climate response as it is currently framed in neoliberal terms. This includes a rejection of the blue-greening approaches, but also a politicization, a recognition that climate finance is at the same time a political engagement. So the key shifts that are occurring, my next slide, please, is that, the next one. There is a shift towards understanding what is called the ecological debt. To put it simply, the climate debt strategy is basically to say that the emissions that we are experiencing today can actually become, but can also be attributed to specific nations and emitters. And because those emitters have benefited over the last 2.5 centuries from emitting, they actually owe the rest of the world a debt which has to be repaid. And that debt is not only the cost of the climate impact on us, but also the benefit accumulating to them. Very simplified, the argument. So the North is the debtor and the South is the creditor. And that, in fact, the quantum of this debt is actually larger than the debt that we owe, and also larger than the climate finance that we are claiming. And that, therefore, instead of engaging in negotiations, quantifying a climate finance goal and so on, what we really need to do is to focus on getting repaid for that debt. Now, of course, for that to happen, you need a legal strategy. But you also need to address that bigger question we talked about earlier. Do we have, in fact, the power balance, which says, even if you are correct, your argument be sustained in a situation where the emitters are more powerful than us? How do we design a legal architecture that can respond to that? In other words, can we use the framings of, for instance, the International Court of Justice, the reparations movement, and so on, to get some recognition of this debt? Next slide. So a very definite transformation began to happen in COP30 in Belgium, which we are still seeking to understand in the climate movement what exactly the impact of this is. You know, I mean, a lot of things happen in the COP, and it is very difficult until. But there was a Belgium to Addis work program that was put in place for the next 2 years, 2026, 2027. And I think we really need to pay serious attention to that, to what that work package actually says and how it is going to affect the outlook of COP32. But one of the main outcomes of the Belgium COP was the agreement on 59 indicators, or rather the 59 global goal on adaptation indicators. This is significant in the sense that when this conversation started, there were about 10,000 indicators of adaptation that were being touted. There was no agreement about, if we are going to make a demand for adaptation support, what exactly are we going to measure that against? So there was an agreement that there would only be 59 indicators. And almost all of those indicators, in fact, actually speak to the financial aspect and make it clear that there has to be grant-based support for the achievement of those indicators. And we really need to follow progress towards the 59 indicators leading to COP32. The second was that Belgium, in fact, actually emphasized community outcomes over return on investment, very expressly said that, in fact, the focus of climate action should be on strengthening the resilience of communities rather than strengthening the ability of the market to profit from the initiatives. Then, you know, Belgium was based on what they called the Mutirao, how do you pronounce this? Excuse my Portuguese. But Mutirao is basically sort of a Portuguese term to mean a collective, community-based discussion, conversation about issues that concern everyone else. So in other words, what Belgium did was it shifted significantly the focus of the COP process to engagement broadly with communities, governments, private sector, and so on. Of course, significantly, there were more than 1,000 almost 2,000 representatives, lobbyists representing the fossil fuel companies. But I think they were exposed as part of the Mutirao sort of, and this culminated in a demand that adaptation finance should be tripled and should be. The big debate was tripling from what? The current adaptation finance available is about 300 billion or what? The gap is close to in the trillions. But that is going to be a debate that is going to affect COP32. There were also some. This is about the scorecard on the achievement of the objectives. But I think the point I want to make is there were some nations, developed nations from the north, which actually began to align with African and developing country positions. We'll refer to them as emerging champions here, for lack of a better term. But these are countries that have actually increased their contributions to climate finance in grants. They are making grants-first pledges. They are also offering to be very they deliver climate finance, in other words, to open their books for review by all of us. And they will also be separating grants, loans from mobilization. So they are also moving away from that mobilization language. So they are more powerful than us because they are more developed, but their behavior is becoming more positive in terms of how it aligns to the intentions of developing countries. So in conclusion, last slide, I think we can say that the investment only as the source of climate finance has been exposed. So that strategy, that narrative, I think is now under question from many different sectors, quarters and stakeholders. But also there is a contestation of the quality of finance. There's a lot of questions being asked about even where grants are delivered, how exactly are they being structured and how do they contribute to the climate. And there's an increasing focus on the sovereignty of nations to define what they want to do, how they want it to be financed, and so on. So the struggle, I think it has shifted away from just a discussion about how much finance to a discussion, a debate, a narrative about is it just, is it equitable, what form does it take, and what kind of power authority can be exercised over that finance. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, James, and apologies, we had to rush you a little bit. It's his farewell lecture, and we wanted to hear from him. So actually, let him take the time, not all the time he needed, but as much time as we could afford. Just to reassure everyone here. So James has done a really excellent job for us. He's mapped the issues that we need to deal with going forward. We do have processes for dealing with these issues, so you don't have to worry about this. So we have a post-COP consultation meetings that we'll be organizing jointly with the AUC that will reflect on the Addis to Belém questions that James raised, for example. The government of Ethiopia asked us to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the road to COP32. So looking at everything else that has happened before leading up to COP32. So nearly all the questions James has posed, we'll need to address through that comprehensive analysis. So if you are interested in any of this work, please reach out to our colleagues, Aman. I think you received email from Aman inviting you to this meeting. Just note your interest. I start by indicating this to reassure you because we're not going to have enough time to engage with the really fundamental questions that James posed. It will not do justice to James or to those questions if we take 2 minutes to deal with those, but we do have platforms to deal with those. We must leave this room at exactly 11:30. We must also leave virtually at exactly 11:30 because we also have another farewell lecture for a colleague of ours, and that farewell lecture begins at exactly 11:30, both physically and virtually. So I'm going to ask our discussants. First of all, I've reduced the time allocated to you without asking you, using my power of the microphone. So I'm only giving you 3 minutes each You don't need to because you can't. So you can't respond to any of the issues James raised in substance, but you can pick one or even just sort of reflect on James. But please, so that we do hear from all of you and maybe have a brief interaction with the rest of the team, please try to keep to the 3 minutes. Maybe just identify one thing that you wish to share your thoughts on and do that in 3 minutes. I will cut you off now. This is not your farewell moment, so I will have no problems cutting you off. So we'll start with Sam from the AUC. Sam, please.
Thank you, Chair, Dr. Cosmas, and colleagues. Thank you also, Dr. Murombedzi, for this great, important presentation. I think it's difficult to say farewell to a friend, an ally, and a brother who has contributed so much to the struggles of climate justice in Africa. And I know to celebrate this collective effort, and you will be contributing to the struggle again. So you're not leaving, but the journey continues and the struggle continues. Allow me to just, like Dr. Cosmos says, to just respond just briefly to some of these very important issues that Dr. Murombedzi has raised. First is the presentation actually captured our feelings as Africans directly, especially on climate finance, which has been reframed as a duty to opportunity. What used to be discussed as obligations has now been framed as a responsibility. And so for us, this means that our climate vulnerability is being treated now as a new asset class. The key question is no longer how much money is flowing, but in what form and in whose time, and also who carries the risk. Second, the lecture is the right to emphasize that our constrained agencies, especially African governments, do not accept loan or debt for national swap because we love them. We accept them because we are operating under a debt distress, narrow fiscal space, like you mentioned, and a chronic shortage of grants. This is not a genuine consent, as we all know. For us and everybody in the room, this means that we cannot evaluate African climate choices only as a technical design issues. We must analyze the debt overhang, the credit rating, and the conditionalities that shape these choices. Third is a critic of the debt for nature swap, the nature-based solution that you touched on, and the green bond. They speak directly to the current realities in Africa. When our forests, our mangroves, and our rangelands are turned into assets, three problems then repeat themselves. What are these problems? The illegitimate debts are now turned green, as part of our territories are effectively outsourced for foreign intermediaries. And local communities and indigenous peoples are pushed out of the margins, sometimes even displaced, as we see in some of our communities in East Africa. So any climate instruments we must accept must therefore be sovereignty first. And I believe Dr. Murombedzi's lecture has emphasized that. It must be sovereignty first. It must strengthen and not weaken our democratic control over land, over resources, and policy. Lastly, your presentation talks on the new, it highlights a promising way to go. The legal and the narrative shift towards ecological depth and reparatory justice, especially after the ICJ advisory opinion and the Belém package. So for Africa, this is critical opening. The message is clear. We are not simply investment destination or solution providers. We are also ecological creditors. The 1.3 trillion that is being discussed should not be framed as a private capital to be mobilized, but as part of a duty to repair harm that has been done, not by Africa. And so the post-Belém scorecard as indicators give us a leverage as well, Dr. Murombedzi, but not only if we use them politically. So they show us that for every $5 in climate finance we receive, we are paying back $7 in debt servicing. So they show that adaptation finance is still overwhelmingly debt. And so for Africa policymakers, the implication is that we must negotiate collectively through the various platforms that we have, that is through the African Union, the G20, or the vulnerable group of 20, which are mostly from Africa, the borrowers platform, to assist us and insist on grant first. And Article 9.1 must be implemented as it is written, because we've been deviating from that. So to help us measure this, not just in dollars mobilized, but lives protected across the continent, sovereignty preserved, and ecological debt repaid. So I see this presentation, therefore, not as a critique of the past decades of climate finance, Dr. Murombedzi, but as a blueprint for how Africa can help lead the narrative correction form. I mean, from investment opportunity back to responsibility, justice, and sovereign delivery. I believe if we are able to continue to repackage this, and like Dr. Cosmas says, even in the post-COP, post-ACS2, and post-CCDA 13 that we'll be having next month, let the narrative begin to shift in the light of this lecture. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ogallah, for very insightful remarks. You went over my time limit by 2 minutes. Without much further ado, Linus, please, 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cosmas. Thank you very much, Dr. James, for such an enlightened lecture, as usual. It gave me the nostalgia of our good old days at the ACPC, where we used to have this type of deep interrogations also amongst ourselves. One thing really picked me when you were lecturing, Dr. James, when you were presenting your lecture, and you said, if you're hungry and somebody brings you food, because you're hungry, you eat. This is the problem, right? Because we've gone from the history of common but differentiated responsibilities to common but differentiated recklessness, because at Copenhagen 2015, COP15, a number from the air came, 100 billion. We just took it because we were hungry. Instead of saying, what is this 100 billion? We didn't take time to interrogate it, to ask, what do we need? We could have chosen to go on hunger strike until we get the solution that we want, instead of going along with this 100 billion that meant nothing, and then ending up where we are today. And of course, we have not learned the lessons, because at COP28 in Dubai, when the loss and damage fund was operationalized and replenished with 700 billion, again, many of us were busy countries celebrating and thinking, how much of this can I get? Because you're hungry and they bring you any food, it could even be dog's vomit, and you still choose to eat it. And then, of course, you will end up in a situation where you don't want to be. So therefore, we should have taken time to say what are our climate finances, because the flaw of climate finance is, what is it? What is it for? How much is it? We never took time to say, how much is that climate finance? Therefore, what are we asking for? And you recall, Dr. James, that when we did our free rest, the Africa Climate Resilient Investment Facility, the idea was that we will find out how much it costs to make the build of our infrastructure more climate resilient, and then that additional cost will be the climate finance that we're demanding. So we're saying, look, we would have had to build our schools and our roads anyway, but because of your recklessness that causes climate change, we now have to spend this additional amount of money to make it more resilient, and you have to pay for it. We didn't do that. And we still haven't done the quantification of what our climate finance needs are, and then we just go along with whatever is happening. And we have also not been thinking smart, right? Because at the moment, we know that Africa is contributing about 7% of global oil production. What if African countries choose to say, as a collective, we will charge a certain amount, let's say 10 cents for every barrel of oil that is leaving the continent, every log of timber, and so on. Then you can use that to finance the development that we need, or our transition. But then you also talked about shifting from duty, Dr. James, to opportunity, and then the need that we need to go back to duty. The question is, what duty? We've seen what is happening at the World Economic Forum. There is no duty. You are not fighting. The hegemony is there. It's very clear. So who is going to ensure that the duty is dutied? It's not possible. So we have to then think very, very differently. The hegemony is there. The hypocrisy is all there. So I think sticking back to this idea of duty, I think we'll still go on the wrong foot. So we need to go back to this idea of how do we, Dr. James, you mentioned about enlightened self-interest, win-win. What win-win strategies can we put in place that enables us to get there rather than just eating any dog's or cat vomit that is brought to us because you think you're hungry? So, and then, of course, you also mentioned the idea of ensuring, and Sam, thank you for emphasizing Article 9.1. But then also, we have been lazy in the narrative because we were going along all the way. Article 2.1c, make climate finance flows consistent with climate resilient low emission. What was it that you were signing? What does that mean? And now you have seen how that is holding back what level of financing that you can get. So I think we need to rethink, use this opportunity, Dr. James, of this narrative to say, we will stay hungry, we'll go on hunger strike, we will figure out what needs to be done, we'll understand the hegemony, we'll understand how to deal with the hegemony, and there are ways in different African proverbs. You can kill a snake by holding it at a particular point. We need to understand those points. Where can you need to hold a snake so that you can kill it and so on? And then that way, hopefully, we are in a position where we can get the right type of finance flows that are needed. But I think we must wake up from the boiling frog mentality, boiling toad phenomenon, because as you know, the boiling toad phenomenon is that if you put a toad in water, lukewarm water, and you gradually turn up the temperature, it will just sit there and it will boil and die. But if you drop it in water at 30 degrees, it will jump straight away out. So hopefully we'll leverage this wonderful narrative, Dr. James, to see how we can. And I'm glad that you are leaving ECA, but they say that you can take the boy out of the ECA, but you cannot take the ECA out of the boy, and you're not leaving the whole space. So we'll continue this discussion, and hopefully we'll come out with a new narrative, a new approach on how we position Africa in this new world order. Thank you very much for once again enlightening us and intriguing our thoughts. Cosmas, I know that you are a dictator. You insisted that I must only stick with 3 minutes. I hope I didn't go beyond 3 minutes. Thank you.
You went 5 minutes, but it was worth it. Thank you very much, Linus. Marsha?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Please confirm you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Apologies, I couldn't join you. I'm in Philippines right now. Let me start from appreciating the framing of the bigger order, the architecture we live in, where there is a global order that is geared towards capital accumulation, or an order that always looks consistently and continuously searches for the next fix. And this seems to be green energy. Therefore, to me, what we have is the fix for capital accumulation. And that's how I would take your introductory intervention, Dr. Murombedzi. I really liked how you framed agency and constrained agency. And this is where we need to be very careful in romanticizing the Africa Group of Negotiators, AGN, as we know it, as Africa's collective agency, because in practice, what we are getting is the power of language. You will hear people say, let's be realistic. Who will take you seriously if you propose this? Well, that may not be feasible. Let's be pragmatic. So what we really have, as you said, constraint is a qualified agency. Otherwise, how would you explain how we came back from Baku, with the ridiculous amount of money? We were in Belém just the other day. Did you hear anyone talking about reparations? Despite being in Brazil, did we articulate our special needs and special circumstances, where in COP32, there in Addis, will be on the agenda, I'm told. And then on your framing, I also liked your analytical positioning, And I would want to even extend it. Who has the power to establish the truth, quote unquote, the truth? Who is shaping the narrative? Because it's not necessarily the duty bearers that are establishing, my God, the truth, the narrative, rather those that have proximity to power that is now being legitimatized, being legible by our governments and by our African Union Commission. And this was evident in 2023, for instance, where the McKinsey Consulting Group came and told us that, you know what, to attract investment, why don't you position Africa as a global solution, climate solution provider? Are we sitting down to interrogate who came up with this narrative? What is the process? Ultimately, who is going to benefit? Is this another encroachment in the space to profit while leaving us at the bottom tier of suppliers, raw material suppliers? Another thing, when you were talking about the just energy transition partnerships, and since your framing is on climate financing, do you know that there is a recent study that did comparative analysis on these countries, South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Senegal, of the financial pledges amounting to 30.8 billion? Did you know that only 3 to 4% of this financing is provided as grants, with the remainder structured as concessional loans, commercial lending, and risk-sharing instruments? What else? Across all these 4 countries, renewables deployment therefore proceeds alongside continued fossil fuel dependence. So this is consistent with the literature that actually there is no transition happening. The pattern is additive expansion of energy, which is the fix that I spoke about. I will not belabor much because I'm going to share with you my comments, but I really want to say finally this. In your summary of the post-Bellem outlook, I felt you could strengthen it given the madness that is happening right now. That is the increasingly plausible scenario of a complete ecological breakdown, which is driven simultaneously by military and financial imperialism as we see it now, and we call it by its name. We will not tiptoe. There is a possibility, a likelihood that there may be one scenario is a World War III, full-fledged war, the total breakdown of international norms, and the possibility of a world in which the UN no longer exists or functions. So that is one scenario that you can situate. And then from there, the analysis can move to the alternative scenario in which multilateralism survives, but remains contested and structurally unequal. Basically, what is happening now or what has been happening in the last 80 years. In conclusion, the question then becomes not merely how to do things better, but how to do them differently under these conditions and how Africans can build strategies. I submit.
Thank you very much, Marsha. I think that you kept to your time. Charles, obviously this is now getting very one-sided. I thought maybe, they've made most of the points PACJA normally makes, but the floor is yours, Charles. Somebody will have to speak for AGN and everybody else because this is a very one-sided thing, but we'll have the whole processes where everybody will be invited to make their case and we'll review all the other arguments. So don't be shy, even if yours also is on the same side as everybody who has spoken. Charles, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Cosmas. And indeed, I think the chair of the AGN is in this lecture. I thought I saw the incoming chair of the AGN. But all the same, allow me to take a few seconds really to thank UNECA for inviting the PACJA fraternity to this inaugural lecture. I don't want to call it farewell. It cannot be farewell for Dr. Murombedzi. Dr. Murombedzi has been an encyclopedia, of information, on climate change, and really a very close ally of PACJA. Dr. Murombedzi is one person you invite, to come and make a presentation, and he'll never disappoint. And most importantly, he will prepare for that. I remember one time during our summer school sessions, I think cohort 3, when he actually came on board to make a presentation, even though he was disposed. I wasn't feeling well, but he actually decided to actually really avail himself, virtually to make that presentation. So we appreciate you, Dr. Murombedzi, and therefore this inaugural lecture leading is actually welcoming you, really, as our African, son, who is full of knowledge and who can actually speak his mind. And therefore, we're looking to many more lectures, from you. But coming back to the topic of the day, climate finance is a concept that probably has been spoken about a lot. It's a very common within the climate justice space. But what is interesting is that humanity has deliberately and conveniently refused to define climate change. And we all have different concepts around how we interpret this. And from where we sit in the African soil, even if we may not know what climate finance is, but at least we know what is not climate finance. And I think this has been spoken a lot. Climate finance cannot be loans. It cannot be mechanisms that contribute, to oozing out of funds, from Africa. It cannot be reverse flow. And therefore, anything to do, again, with greenwashing and any investments that are actually taking resources out of Africa cannot be climate finance. And therefore, reflecting around the title for the Adaptation Gap Report for last year, which is actually running on empty, I'm tempted to actually think that probably the title would better read, running on negatives, because literally the continent has actually been losing resources than really getting resources that it badly needs, particularly to address the adaptation needs of this particular continent. The same report actually indicates that actually the gap that do exist for adaptation alone is about $310 billion per year. And that, in actual sense, represents, 12 to 14 times, less amount that actually we are receiving at the moment. 26 billion, is probably what we're receiving, and the gap is actually 12 to 14 times more. And the question that we do ask ourselves, are we operating, within a multilateral system that is dysfunctional? Are we operating at a multilateral system that is actually characterized by dishonesty, where even what is not climate finance is actually reported as climate finance? Are we operating at a multilateralism that, as Dr. Murombedzi put it, that has power asymmetry? Do we operate from a common, board, especially when it comes to climate negotiations? Is our agent starting on a common platform again, with others from other regions? Or are we disadvantaged in different ways? Are we experiencing a multilateral system that is full of hypocrisy? Are we also looking at a system that is coming up with commitments that are never fulfilled? The question we do ask ourselves is, what happened to the 100 billion goal, for example? Did we achieve it? Of course, the answer is no. And now what gives us confidence that the new commitments under NCQG, the 300 billion commitment, even though, of course, we are not comfortable with the same, what gives us a guarantee that is going to be achieved if we didn't achieve the 100 billion commitment? That is honestly we are talking about here.
Charles, I really owe you. I don't want to be the one to cut off civil society, but we'll give you the first slot when we have the post-com consultation, because as I said, we have to actually surrender the virtual session to another colleague of ours who's also giving a farewell lecture. The director has been sitting patiently here with me. He actually needs to go open session, and he just sort of wanted a minute to address this gathering. I truly apologize, Charles. We'll find an opportunity to give you a forum, and everyone here, as I said, we'll continue conversations on all the points James has raised. We'll communicate with everyone on how we can continue that conversation going forward. With deepest apologies, Charles. Please, Dr. Lisinge.
No, thank you so much, Cosmas. Really, I didn't want to leave without saying a word on this occasion, because James is a very good friend and professional colleague. I think the lecture was a very serious critique of finance, of climate finance. I think the shift from commitment to a market-led approach or responsibilities came out very clearly from the presentation. And I was just thinking, given the current global dispensation, we know how the UN, the US government, the current US government, we know their position on this issue of climate change. To be blunt, I don't see too much grant coming from the US to Africa. We also know that our friends in Europe, we see somehow backsliding in their commitments, scaling down their ambition. So I see tensions with Africa. We are going to say that, okay, we want something that is win-win for us. I don't see the West coming towards that Africa's position as looking at all of this discussion as it. And so I see a situation where we're moving to another direction and the West is moving to another direction. And this brings me to Linus's point of that we can go on hunger strike, because we said that if somebody is hungry, they will eat whatever. Now, how does that hunger strike translate policy-wise for African countries, especially as Ethiopia is going to host the COP? What are the concrete recommendations that were given to African countries to reflect this position that you've eloquently articulated? What does it mean to go on a hunger strike that Linus is mentioning? I think those are good starting points. If we can translate the dev narrative, going on hunger strike narrative into policy action, can be reflected in the outcome of the Ethiopia's hosting of COP. I think that this meeting would have achieved something good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you very much, colleagues. Apologies, we didn't have time to interact, but let me make this reassurance again. So we do have a task from the Ethiopian government to conduct a comprehensive analysis to COP32. This will be the foundation to that piece of work. We are very keen to engage with all of you, including, I know everybody had an opinion and views on this, including those who are online. We'll set up that process. We'll run it in collaboration with the AUC and the FDB, and there's a proper mechanism for doing that. So we'll be communicating that. For colleagues who are here in the room or who are here in Addis, we are having a farewell party for James at our divisional headquarters, CFND. That's 5th floor. You are welcome to pop by. And also there's a farewell lecture for our colleague Victor Conde beginning just now. I think it's in the other room. Robert is going to lead that conversation. Thank you so much, and please continue the conversation.
Thank you.